The sewing room existed in that hollow space between midnight and dawn when even the house's breathing seemed to pause. Mercy Anwell worked by moonlight, her needle catching silver as it pierced fabric, drew thread, pierced again. The rhythm had become mechanical over these long months, in and out, but what she sewed into the hem of Mistress Adelaide's bedroom curtains was nothing holy, nothing pure. Black powder whispered into the fold like a terrible secret. Her fingers did not shake. They had not shaken since the day she stopped being fully alive, since the day she became something else, something patient and calculating and absolutely certain. The powder came from the overseer's stores, stolen grain by grain over months of careful planning, hidden in a tin box beneath the loose floorboard under her pallet. Tonight she will finish the last of it. Tonight, the house will finally be ready. The curtains were heavy damask, ivory silk with pale gold threading that caught lamplight beautifully. Adelaide had commissioned them from Charleston specifically for her chambers, had preened when they arrived, running her soft white hands over fabric that cost more than Mercy's life was worth. Now Mercy folded that same fabric over her lap, opened the hem with her smallest scissors, and poured a thin line of powder into the channel she'd created. The weight of it surprised her each time, how something so fine could feel so heavy with purpose. She stitched the hem closed with invisible seams, the kind of work she'd been taught since childhood, when her own mother had still been alive to teach her. Her mother, who died of fever when Mercy was 12. Her mother, whose last words had been survival, just survived. Mercy had survived. Her daughter had not. The thought came with no emotion anymore, just a flat statement of fact. Calla was dead. The Thornleys had killed her. Everything else followed from those two truths with the inevitability of sunrise. A sound in the hallway made her freeze, needle suspended mid-stitch, breath caught in her throat. Footsteps. Heavy ones, a man's gait, uneven. Drunk, probably. The footsteps passed the sewing room door without pausing, continuing down toward the east wing where Virgil Thornley kept his rooms. She exhaled slowly, resumed her work. The house at night was a different creature than in daylight. The Greek Revival mansion that looked so grand from the drive, with its white columns and wide verandas, revealed itself after dark as something older and more malevolent. The floorboards creaked with sounds like crying. The walls settled with groans that might have been the wood or might have been something else. Shadows moved in ways shadows shouldn't, pooling in corners, stretching across doorways, sometimes taking shapes that looked almost human. Mercy had stopped being frightened of the shadows 3 months ago, around the time she realized they were helping her. The first time she'd seen one clearly, she'd been working in this same room, sewing powder into the library curtains. She'd looked up and seen a woman standing in the doorway, a woman who shouldn't have been there, whose form rippled like heat haze, whose eyes were dark hollows. Mercy had recognized her, Delilah, who'd worked in the kitchens, who'd been beaten to death by Edmund Thornley 5 years ago for burning his breakfast. Delilah, who was buried in the unmarked field behind the quarters with all the others. Delilah had smiled at her, a terrible, sad, knowing smile, and then faded into nothing. After that, Mercy saw them all. The dead of Thornley Orchard, the ones who'd suffered under this family's cruelty, the ones who'd been worked to death or beaten or simply worn down until their hearts stopped. They gathered in doorways and corners, watching her work, and she felt their approval like a physical presence, warm and waiting and hungry. Tonight, as she finished the last stitch on Adelaide's curtains, she heard it, humming. A child's voice, tuneless and sweet, singing a lullaby Mercy used to sing to Calla before sleep. The sound came from behind her, near the window that looked out over the east orchard. Mercy didn't turn around. If she turned around, she would see nothing, and somehow that was worse than not looking at all. Almost done, baby girl, she whispered to the empty room. The humming continued for a moment, then faded like morning mist. She stood, her knees aching. She was 31 years old but felt ancient, hollowed out, and carried the curtains to the hallway. The house stretched before her in darkness, moonlight falling through windows in pale squares on the floor. Every curtain she passed, every tapestry on the walls, every upholstered chair and settee, all of them held her work. 3 months of patient, methodical preparation. Pounds of powder, sewn into the very fabric of the Thornleys' lives, waiting for a single spark. Adelaide's chambers were in the south wing, a suite of rooms decorated with the kind of careless wealth that made Mercy's teeth ache. She let herself in, slaves didn't knock, slaves were invisible, and found the room exactly as she'd left it hours ago when she'd taken down the curtains for mending. The windows stood bare, letting in moonlight that painted everything silver and strange. The bed dominated the room, a massive four-poster draped in more silk, more fabric she'd already treated. Adelaide lay sleeping in it, snoring softly, her face slack in repose. Without the animation of cruelty, she looked almost human. Almost. Mercy hung the curtains with steady hands, attaching them to the rods, arranging the folds just so. They fell in perfect cascades, pooling slightly on the floor the way Adelaide preferred. Beautiful. Deadly. The mistress would wake in a few hours, never knowing that her bedroom had become a tinderbox, that everything soft and lovely surrounding her was ready to burn. When the curtains were in place, Mercy stood back to admire her work. The moonlight caught the gold threading, making it shimmer. In 6 months, Adelaide Thornley would be dead. So would her husband, her children, their guests. The house itself would be ashes. And maybe, the dead would finally rest. A figure materialized in the corner of the room, near Adelaide's vanity. Calla. 9 years old forever, her face still bearing the bruises from where Virgil Thornley had struck her, her neck bent at the wrong angle. She smiled at her mother, reaching out one translucent hand. Mercy's eyes burned, but no tears came. She'd cried herself dry in the 3 days after Calla died, and since then there'd been nothing but this cold, clear purpose. She reached back toward her daughter's ghost, their fingers not quite touching, separated by the membrane between life and death. "Soon," Mercy whispered. "Soon, baby. Mama promises." Calla's smile widened, and for just a moment she looked happy, truly happy, the way she'd been before the Thornleys broke her. Then she faded, melting into the shadows, leaving Mercy alone with the sleeping mistress and the powder-filled curtains and the terrible weight of what was coming. Mercy left the room as silently as she'd entered, pulling the door closed behind her. The hallway stretched before her, and she walked it like a woman in a dream, trailing her fingers along the wallpaper. Behind the silk covering, she knew, was horsehair plaster, old wood, the bones of the house. And woven into the tapestries hanging at intervals, the hunting scene near the stairs, the pastoral landscape outside Edmund's study, the biblical tableau in the dining room, was enough powder to turn those bones to splinters. She'd been so careful. So patient. Taking tiny amounts at first, just a few grains of powder from the overseer's stores, then gradually more as she learned Silas Rourke's patterns. He was a cruel man, vicious even by the standards of overseers, but he was also predictable. He drank himself stupid every third night, and on those nights the powder shed was easy to access if you knew where he kept the keys. Tobias had helped with that. Old Tobias, who'd been on this plantation for 40 years, who'd seen 3 generations of Thornleys inflict 3 generations of suffering. He'd noticed what she was doing, she wasn't sure how, the old man just knew things, and instead of stopping her, he'd enabled it. Found reasons to keep Rourke distracted, accidentally, left doors unlocked, never asked questions. Some knowledge was too dangerous to speak aloud. Dinah knew too. The cook, who ruled the kitchen with quiet efficiency and had buried 2 daughters and a son in the unmarked field. She'd looked at Mercy one morning about 2 months ago, really looked at her, and something had passed between them. Understanding. Permission. After that, the Thornley family's meals had changed subtly, nothing obvious, nothing that would kill, but herbs that made them sleepy, sluggish, and less attentive. Small mercies that helped Mercy's work. The conspiracy of the oppressed was silent and total. No one spoke of it directly, but they all knew. Something was coming. The house itself seemed to know, settling and creaking with anticipation, its shadows growing longer and darker even at noon. Mercy reached the back stairs, the servants' stairs, narrow and steep, and descended into the lower floor. The kitchen was dark, the fire banked for the night. The servants' hall led to the back door, and beyond that, the path to the quarters. She paused at the threshold, looking back at the house. From here she could see into the grand hallway, where the chandelier hung dark and waiting. She could see the drawing-room door, behind which lay the furniture she'd upholstered herself, each cushion packed with powder in the batting. She could see the library, the dining room, the music room where Constance Thornley played her piano and pretended not to hear the screaming from the quarters. Every room held her work. Every room was ready. The party was tomorrow night, Edmund's celebration, his gathering of neighboring plantation families to toast their prosperity and their power. They would fill this house with laughter and wine, never knowing they stood in the center of something waiting to ignite. One spark. That was all it would take. One candle tipped, one lamp overturned, one moment of carelessness, and everything she'd built would cascade into fire. Mercy stepped outside, closing the door softly behind her. The March air was unseasonably warm, carrying the scent of the orchards, peach and apple trees heavy with premature blooms that would rot on the branch because something was wrong with the soil, with the land itself. The fruit that did grow came out bruised and sweet with decay, and lately the smell of it had become overwhelming, like the earth itself was going bad. She walked the path to the quarters, a row of wooden cabins that leaked when it rained and froze in winter and baked in summer. Home, such as it was. Her pallet was in the women's cabin, third from the door. She lay down on it without undressing, staring up at the ceiling where moonlight fell through gaps in the roof. Tomorrow. Everything happened tomorrow. She should feel something, fear, excitement, regret, anything. But there was only this hollow certainty, this sense of being a tool in the hands of something larger. The dead wanted justice. The land wanted blood. The house wanted to burn. She was simply the instrument through which it would happen. In the darkness above her, shadows gathered and shifted. She saw them clearly now, dozens of figures, the accumulated dead of Thornley Orchard, standing and sitting and hovering in the spaces between. They watched her with eyes like empty wells, and she watched back, and they understood each other perfectly. Calla sat at the foot of her pallet, her small form more solid than the others, more present. Her daughter. Her baby. Her reason for everything. Tomorrow, Mercy said again, speaking to the dead, speaking to herself. Tomorrow we burn it all down. The shadows rippled like wind over water. Somewhere in the main house, something settled with a sound like a sigh. The orchards rustled though there was no breeze. Mercy closed her eyes, but she didn't sleep. She hadn't really slept in 6 months. Instead, she lay still and counted her breaths and waited for dawn, her needle-scarred fingers folded over her chest, already imagining how the flames would look as they climbed the powder-soaked curtains, how the screams would echo through rooms that had heard so much screaming already, how the house would finally pay for what it had done. The dead kept watch around her bed. Patient. Waiting. Almost time. If you're enjoying this dark tale, subscribe for more macabre horror stories, and let me know in the comments what you think happens next. The summer had been unusually hot that year, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer and turned the clay roads to dust. By September, the orchards at Thornley Orchard hung heavy with fruit that split on the branch, too ripe, rotting from the inside out. The smell of it, sweet and fetid, drifted through the open windows of the main house where the Thornley family sat for afternoon tea, a ritual Mistress Adelaide insisted upon with religious fervor. Calla was 9 years old and small for her age, all knobby knees and careful movements. She'd been assigned to house service that summer, a promotion of sorts. Closer to the family meant closer to danger, but it also meant shoes and better food and sleeping in the house quarters instead of the cabins. Mercy had accepted this with the resignation of someone who understood that every choice was already made for her, that autonomy was an illusion granted only to those born free. The child carried the tea service on a tray too large for her small hands, concentrating fiercely on keeping it steady. The china was Wedgwood, imported from England, each piece worth more than every person in the quarters combined. Adelaide had explained this often, how the delicate blue and white pattern was called jasperware, how it had been made by craftsmen whose names were recorded in history while people like Mercy and Calla would die without anyone marking their passing. The parlor was decorated in the height of fashion, or what passed for fashion in South Carolina in 1841. Heavy velvet curtains in deep burgundy, furniture upholstered in brocade, Turkish carpets layered over polished wood floors. Every surface was crowded with objects, porcelain figurines, silver candlesticks, oil paintings in gilt frames showing pastoral scenes that bore no resemblance to the plantation's reality. The room spoke of wealth accumulated through generations of human suffering, though the Thornleys would never have phrased it that way. Edmund Thornley sat in his chair by the window, a man of 54 years who'd grown thick around the middle but still carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. His face had once been handsome, Mercy could see traces of it in the bone structure, but years of drinking and rage had coarsened his features, left his skin ruddy and his eyes perpetually bloodshot. He was reading a newspaper from Charleston, muttering about politics, about the growing abolitionist movement in the North, about threats to their way of life. Adelaide presided over the tea service with practiced grace, her hands moving through the ritual of pouring and arranging. She was 48 but looked older, her face pinched with perpetual dissatisfaction. She wore an afternoon dress in pale yellow silk, her hair arranged in elaborate ringlets that had taken her lady's maid 2 hours to perfect. Everything about her was calculated performance, the gracious hostess, the Christian woman, the benevolent mistress. It was a lie so complete she'd begun to believe it herself. Their eldest son, Virgil, lounged on the settee with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never had to work for anything. At 26, he was his father's son in every way, the same thick build going to fat, the same quick temper, the same casual cruelty that came from viewing other humans as property. He'd been managing the orchards for 3 years now, and in that time, 6 enslaved people had died from overwork or punishment. No one questioned this. Dead slaves were written off as losses in the ledger, nothing more. Constance sat at the piano, picking out a melody with one hand while she sipped her tea with the other. At 23, she was the beauty of the family, with her mother's fine features and her father's height. She played well. Mercy had heard her practicing for hours, the same pieces over and over until they were perfect. The piano was her refuge, her way of maintaining the fiction that she was above the ugliness around her. If she played loudly enough, she could pretend she didn't hear the sounds from the quarters, the crack of the overseer's whip, the crying that sometimes drifted across the lawn. The youngest, Beaumont, was away at university in Virginia, a fact Adelaide mentioned frequently, proud of her son's education, his prospects. He would return for the harvest season in a few weeks, bringing friends to admire the plantation, to hunt in the woods, to participate in the theater of southern gentility that required so much blood to maintain. Mercy stood against the wall, hands folded, eyes downcast. This was her place during these afternoon rituals, present but invisible, ready to serve, careful never to draw attention. She'd learned long ago how to make herself small, how to anticipate needs before they were voiced, how to survive in spaces that would crush her if she gave them cause to notice. Calla approached the table, the tea tray trembling slightly in her grip. The child was nervous. Mercy could see it in the tension of her shoulders, the way she bit her lower lip. She'd warned Calla that morning, be careful, be perfect, don't give them any reason. But children were children, and fear made hands unsteady. The girl set the tray down on the side table, began transferring items to the main tea service. A plate of biscuits. A bowl of preserves. The sugar bowl with its tiny silver spoon. The teacups themselves, one by one, settling them onto saucers with the kind of concentration that made Mercy's heart clench. Careful, girl, Adelaide said without looking up, her voice carrying that particular tone of preemptive displeasure. Calla nodded, mute with effort. She lifted the last teacup, delicate blue and white, a Greek goddess dancing across its surface, and turned toward the table. Later, Mercy would replay this moment endlessly, would see it in her dreams and waking hours alike. The way Calla's foot caught on the edge of the carpet. The way she stumbled, just slightly, her arms windmilling for balance. The way the teacup tilted, fell, tumbled through the air in what seemed like slow motion. It hit the floor with a sound that was both softer and louder than it should have been. Not a full break, just a chip, a piece of the rim cracking off and skittering across the polished wood. The cup itself rolled to a stop against the table leg, intact except for that single missing piece. The silence that followed was absolute. Calla stood frozen, staring down at the broken china, her face draining of all color. Mercy felt her own heart stop, felt ice flood her veins. No, she thought. Please, God, no. Edmund looked up from his newspaper. His face, which had been merely irritated, transformed into something else, something dark and terrible. The change was instant, like a door opening onto something that had always been waiting beneath the surface. You clumsy little, he rose from his chair, the newspaper falling forgotten to the floor. Do you have any idea what that cost? Calla's mouth opened, closed. No sound came out. She was 9 years old and terrified beyond speech. Father, Constance said quietly, her hand stilling on the piano keys. It's just a cup. Silence. Edmund's voice cracked across the room like a whip. He moved toward Calla with frightening speed for a man of his size. These people need to learn. They need to understand there are consequences. Mercy stepped forward instinctively. Master, please, she didn't mean. I wasn't talking to you. Edmund didn't even look at her. His focus was entirely on Calla, on the child who dared to break his property. Virgil. Hold her. Virgil stood slowly, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. This was entertainment to him, Mercy realized with horror. This was a sport. No, Mercy said, louder now, abandoning all pretense of deference. Please, Master Edmund, I'll pay for it, I'll work extra, please don't. Get her out of here. Edmund jerked his chin toward Mercy. Rourke. The overseer must have been waiting in the hall, he often was, during the family's tea time, ready to handle any disturbances. Silas Rourke was a lean man with a face like a hatchet and eyes that found pleasure in others' pain. He grabbed Mercy by the arms, his fingers digging into her flesh hard enough to bruise. No. Mercy struggled against his grip, watching as Virgil caught Calla by the shoulder. Don't touch her. Don't you dare. Rourke dragged her backward toward the door. The last thing she saw before he forced her into the hallway was Calla's face, pale and terrified, tears streaming down her cheeks as Virgil held her in place. Then the door slammed shut, and Rourke shoved Mercy against the wall hard enough to drive the breath from her lungs. Stay, he said, his face inches from hers, his breath reeking of tobacco. You go back in there, I'll make it worse for both of you. Through the door, she heard it begin. Edmund's voice, rising in anger. The sound of a blow, flesh on flesh, and Calla's cry. Another blow. Another. Virgil's laughter. And underneath it all, impossibly, the sound of the piano. Constance had resumed playing, louder now, some complicated piece by Mozart or Beethoven, the notes cascading over each other in an attempt to drown out the sounds of a child being beaten for breaking a teacup. Mercy slid down the wall, Rourke's hand still on her shoulder, pinning her in place. She counted the blows by Calla's cries, 5, 6, 7. After the 10th, the cries became weaker, thinner. After the 15th, they stopped altogether. The piano played on. Constance's fingers never faltered, never missed a note. The music filled the house like a prayer, like a spell, like a lie they all agreed to tell themselves about who they were and what they were doing. When the parlor door finally opened, Edmund emerged first, straightening his waistcoat, his face flushed but satisfied. Behind him, Virgil carried Calla in his arms, the child's body was limp, her head lolling, blood streaming from her nose and mouth. Her left arm hung at a wrong angle. Her breathing was shallow, labored. Take her to the quarters, Edmund said to Virgil, not looking at Mercy. Have Dinah tend to her. And someone will clean up that mess in the parlor. He walked away down the hall, already dismissing the incident from his mind. Adelaide emerged next, stepping carefully around the blood that had dripped onto the hallway floor, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval, though whether she disapproved of the beating or simply the disruption to her afternoon tea was impossible to say. Rourke released Mercy, and she staggered forward, following Virgil as he carried Calla toward the back of the house. The child's eyes were swollen shut, her face already purpling with bruises. Blood soaked into Virgil's shirt, but he didn't seem to notice or care. Shouldn't have been so clumsy, he said conversationally as they walked. Father's right. You people need to learn. Mercy said nothing. She couldn't trust herself to speak, couldn't trust what might come out if she opened her mouth. Behind them, the piano music finally stopped, leaving only silence and the sound of Calla's rattling breath. They reached the quarters as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that looked like fire. Virgil dropped Calla onto Mercy's pallet without ceremony, wiped his bloody hands on his trousers, and left without another word. Dinah came running with clean clothes and water, her face grim. She'd seen this before, they all had. She began cleaning the blood, checking for broken bones, her hands gentle but her expression telling Mercy everything she needed to know. Get Tobias, Dinah said quietly. Have him fetch the doctor from town. Master won't pay for a doctor for her, Mercy said, her voice hollow. I know. But get him anyway. Mercy ran to the stables, and found Tobias already saddling a horse. The old man had heard somehow, news traveled fast in the quarters, carried on invisible networks of shared suffering. Going now, he said. Don't know if it'll matter, child. Please hurry. He rode out as darkness fell, and Mercy returned to her daughter's side. Calla's breathing had worsened, each inhaling a wet rattle that spoke of internal damage. Her small body was broken in ways Mercy couldn't see, wouldn't know how to fix even if she could. She gathered the child into her arms, careful not to jostle her, and held her through the long night. Others came and went, Ruth, who brought blankets, Amos, who stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, unable to find words, Isaac, who wept openly. They all knew. They all understood what this meant. The doctor never came. Tobias returned near dawn, alone, reporting that the doctor had refused to come for a slave child, especially one injured on Edmund Thornley's orders. Not my place to interfere with a man's discipline of his property, the doctor had said. As the sky lightened from black to gray, Calla opened her eyes one final time. They were unfocused, looking at something Mercy couldn't see. Her lips moved, forming words too soft to hear. Mercy leaned close. "What, baby? What is it? Don't cry, Mama." The words were barely a whisper, blood-flecked and fading. "Don't cry." Then she was gone. One moment her daughter was there, breathing, present, and the next she was simply empty, her eyes staring at nothing, her small chest still. Mercy did cry then, holding her daughter's body, rocking back and forth as the sun rose over Thornley Orchard. She cried until her throat was raw, until no more tears would come, until she was hollow and scraped clean of everything except a single, burning certainty. This could not stand. This would not stand. At the exact moment Calla died, every candle in the quarters blew out simultaneously, though there was no wind. The sudden darkness was absolute, broken only by the growing dawn light outside. In that darkness, Mercy felt them, presence gathering, watching. The dead of Thornley Orchard, drawn by fresh suffering, by a death that demanded an answer. When the candles were relit, Mercy saw them clearly for the first time. Shadows that held human shapes, figures that stood in corners and doorways, dozens of them. They watched her with eyes like empty wells, and she felt their hunger, their rage, their terrible patience. They had been waiting. Now, finally, they had an instrument. Dinah saw them too. Mercy could tell by the way the older woman's eyes tracked something invisible, by the way she crossed herself and murmured a prayer. But she said nothing, just helped prepare Calla's body for burial. They buried her that afternoon in the field behind the quarters, where dozens of others lay in unmarked graves. The dirt was soft there, Tobias said, easy to dig. It was soft because of all the bodies that had fed it over the years, all the people who died building Thornley wealth and left nothing behind but bones and soil. As they lowered Calla's body into the ground, wrapped in a clean sheet because that was all they had, Mercy felt the earth beneath her knees. It was warm, impossibly warm for September, warm in a way that felt alive and aware. When she placed her hand flat against the dirt, she felt it respond, felt a pulse that might have been her imagination or might have been something else entirely. The others left one by one, offering condolences, touching her shoulder, crying their own tears for their own losses reflected in hers. Finally, only Mercy remained, kneeling beside the raw grave as the sun set. "I promise," she said to the earth, to her daughter, to the dead who watched from the shadows. "I promise you'll be avenged. I promise they'll pay. I promise I'll burn that house to its foundations and everyone in it." The earth seemed to warm further beneath her hands. The shadows drew closer, their approval palpable. Somewhere in the main house, a candle guttered and went out. In the orchards, fruit dropped from branches though there was no wind, splitting open on the ground, already rotting. The dead had heard her promise. They would hold her to it. Mercy stood, brushed the dirt from her skirt, and looked toward the main house where lights blazed in every window. The Thornleys were having dinner. She could hear the faint sounds of conversation and laughter drifting across the lawn. They'd already forgotten about Calla, about the broken teacup, about the child they'd murdered for the crime of being clumsy. But Mercy hadn't forgotten. Would never forget. She walked back to the quarters as night fell complete, her shadow stretching long behind her. And if anyone had been watching carefully, they would have seen that her shadow seemed too large for her small frame, seemed to contain multitudes, seemed to ripple with shapes that weren't her own. The work will begin tomorrow. The patient, methodical work of sewing death into silk, of preparing the house for its judgment. She had time. She had patience. She had help from forces that existed in the spaces between life and death. The Thornleys thought they owned everything, the land, the people, even the right to murder children over broken china. They were wrong. They owned nothing. They were already dead, they just didn't know it yet. Mercy lay down on her pallet, still stained with Calla's blood, and stared up at the ceiling. Tomorrow she would begin stealing powder. Tomorrow she would start her needlework. Tomorrow the long, slow march toward fire would begin. But tonight, she simply lay in the darkness, surrounded by the dead who'd gathered to witness her promise, feeling her grief transform into something harder and colder and absolutely implacable. Outside, the orchards rustled with wind that carried the smell of rotting fruit. Inside the main house, Adelaide played her piano, the music drifting across the grounds. In the quarters, the enslaved people whispered to each other in the dark, passing the word, something had changed, something had shifted, something terrible was coming. They were right. Mercy Anwell had died when her daughter did. What remained was simply the instrument of their reckoning. The powder shed stood at the edge of the property, beyond the stables and the smokehouse, where the cultivated grounds gave way to scrub pine and wild growth. Silas Rourke kept it locked, 3 different locks, actually, because he was paranoid about theft and fire in equal measure. Inside were kegs of gunpowder for hunting, for the occasional need to clear stumps, for the armory that Edmund maintained because he feared slave uprisings the way other men feared storms. The irony wasn't lost on Mercy. She'd been watching Rourke for a week before she made her first attempt, learning his patterns the way a hunter learns the habits of prey. Every third night he drank himself into a stupor, corn whiskey he kept hidden in the tack room, cheap stuff that burned going down and left him mean when he was conscious and unconscious when he wasn't. On those nights, he'd stumble to his quarters behind the main house around 10 o'clock and wouldn't emerge until dawn, reeking and ill-tempered. The keys hung on his belt always, but on whiskey nights, he was careless. Mercy had seen him pass out still fully dressed, boots on, keys dangling. It was Tobias who confirmed her suspicions, who mentioned casually one morning while she was helping in the stables that Rourke sleeps like the dead when he's been drinking. The old man's eyes met hers for just a moment, and in that moment, she understood he knew what she was planning. Not the specifics, those were too dangerous to speak, but the general shape of it. Revenge. Justice. Fire. Third lock is tricky, Tobias added, running a curry comb over the mare's flank. Stick sometimes. Got to jiggle it just right. That was all he said. All he needed to say. The first night Mercy tried, her hands shook so badly she could barely work the locks. She'd waited until well past midnight, had listened at Rourke's door until his snoring rattled like death itself, had lifted the keys from his belt with fingers that felt numb and clumsy. The walk to the powder shed seemed to take hours, every shadow a threat, every sound a warning. The first 2 locks opened easily. The third stuck, just as Tobias had said, and she stood there in the darkness, jiggling the key, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Finally, it turned. The door swung open with a creak that sounded like a scream in the quiet night. Inside, the shed smelled of sulfur and saltpeter and something else, something like lightning before a storm. Moonlight fell through the single window, illuminating 3 kegs stacked against the far wall, along with smaller containers, horn flasks, and the tools for measuring and mixing. More powder than she'd imagined. Enough to blow the shed itself to splinters if someone was careless with a spark. Enough to burn a house. Her hand steadied. She'd brought a tin box, small enough to conceal, and she opened the nearest keg with shaking fingers. The powder inside was fine and black, almost soft to the touch. She took a pinch, then another, filling the tin halfway before fear overtook caution and she sealed it shut. Getting the keys back onto Rourke's belt was worse than stealing them. She had to enter his quarters, had to stand in the darkness listening to him breathe, had to lean close enough to smell the whiskey on his breath while she clipped the ring back into place. He stirred once, muttering something in his sleep about teaching them, and Mercy froze for a full minute, certain he would wake, certain this was where it ended. But he only rolled over and resumed snoring, and she slipped out like a ghost. Back in her cabin, she hid the tin beneath the loose floorboard under her pallet, covering it with rags and dust. Then she lay down and shook for an hour, adrenaline and terror warring in her blood. But she'd done it. First step taken. The rest would come easier. It didn't come easier. Each theft was its own agony of fear, but she persisted. Every third night, when Rourke drank himself senseless, she took more powder. A little at first, then more as her confidence grew. She learned to move silently, learned which floorboards creaked and which didn't, learned the exact amount of pressure needed to work that stubborn third lock. By November, she had enough to begin her real work. The sewing room became her sanctuary and her laboratory. During the day, she performed her normal duties, mending, hemming, embroidering, all the small tasks that kept a plantation house functioning. But at night, when the family slept and the house settled into its breathing darkness, she began altering the curtains. It was delicate work. She couldn't simply stuff powder into fabric and sew it shut, that would show, would create suspicious bulges and weight. Instead, she opened existing hems with her smallest scissors, creating channels that already existed in the construction. She poured thin lines of powder into these spaces, distributing it evenly, then stitched them closed with the kind of invisible seams that were her specialty. From the outside, nothing looked different. The curtains hung exactly as they always had, heavy and elegant and deadly. She started with the library, Edmund's domain, where he kept his ledgers recording human beings as property, as livestock, as numbers in columns. The burgundy velvet curtains there were thick enough to hold more powder than most, and she spent 3 nights treating them before moving on to the dining room. The house helped her. She'd begun to understand that in December, when she was working late and heard footsteps in the hallway, footsteps that stopped at the sewing room door but never entered. When she looked, no one was there. But she felt their presence, felt the approval of the dead who died in this house, who wanted what she wanted. Calla appeared often now, standing in corners, sitting on the windowsill, watching her mother work with those hollow eyes. Sometimes she smiled. Sometimes she hummed that lullaby. Mercy had stopped being frightened of her daughter's ghost. The dead were more honest than the living. The dead understood justice. Other spirits manifested too. Delilah, beaten to death in the kitchen. Marcus worked until his heart gave out in the fields. Patience, who died in childbirth after Virgil forced himself on her. Sarah, hanged for stealing bread. Dozens of them, the accumulated suffering of Thornley Orchard, gathering in the shadows, waiting for their judgment day. Dinah knew. The cook would look at Mercy sometimes across the kitchen, and her eyes would hold a terrible understanding. In January, the meals began to change subtly. Nothing obvious, just herbs that made people drowsy, combinations that left the Thornleys sluggish and inattentive. Adelaide complained of constant fatigue. Edmund's concentration wandered. Virgil moved slower, reacted less quickly. "Doing what I can," Dinah said once, quietly, when they were alone. "We all got to contribute." Ruth knew too. The older woman who cleaned the house would find Mercy in the sewing room and ask no questions about why she was taking down curtains, mending them, hanging them back up. Instead, she'd help with the heavy lifting, hold the ladder steady, and keep watch for approaching family members. Isaac, who tended the orchards, began reporting strange things. The fruit was rotting on the trees, he said, not from disease but from something else, something wrong with the soil itself. The smell of decay was everywhere now, sweet and cloying, hanging over the property like a curse. Edmund blamed Isaac's incompetence, and had him whipped twice. But the rot continued, spreading through the orchards like judgment. By February, Mercy had treated every major room on the ground floor. The parlor where Calla died. The music room where Constance played piano to drown out screaming. The morning room where Adelaide held her teas. Each space now held pounds of powder hidden in plain sight, woven into the fabric of the Thornleys' daily lives. She moved to the second floor in late February, treating the bedroom curtains while the family slept. This was the most dangerous work, entering their private spaces, moving silently through rooms where they lay unconscious and vulnerable. She could have killed them then, smothered them with pillows, cut their throats while they dreamed. But that wasn't the point. The point was fire. The point was the house itself consuming them, all of them, together. The spirits grew stronger as her work progressed. The house was haunted now in ways that couldn't be denied. Adelaide reported nightmares every morning. Edmund saw shadows moving. Constance swore the piano played itself. Virgil's sleep was troubled by dreams of fire. They were feeling it, the accumulated weight of their crimes, the approaching judgment. But they didn't understand what it meant, didn't connect it to the invisible woman who sewed their doom into silk and velvet. By March, it was done. Every curtain, every tapestry, every upholstered piece of furniture. The house was a tinderbox, beautiful and deadly, waiting for a spark. Mercy stood in the ballroom on a cold March night, looking at the massive curtains she'd just finished, the last ones. Her hands were steady. Her heart was calm. Everything was ready. Behind her, reflected in the darkened windows, she saw them all, the gathered dead, dozens of spirits standing witness. And among them, front and center, was Calla, smiling her terrible smile. "Soon, baby," Mercy whispered. "Just a few more days." The house groaned as if in response. Outside, the rotting orchards rustled. The dead waited, patient and hungry. Everything was prepared. The Thornleys would have their party, their celebration of prosperity built on bones and blood. And then the fire would come, and the house would have its reckoning, and maybe, finally, the dead could rest. Mercy walked from the ballroom, trailing her fingers along powder-filled curtains, feeling the weight of what was coming settle over her like a benediction. She was ready. The house was ready. The dead were ready. All that remained was the spark. If you're enjoying this dark tale, subscribe for more macabre horror stories, and let me know in the comments what you think happens next. Dawn broke cold over Thornley Orchard, the sky the color of old bruises. Mercy woke before the bell, as she always did now, and lay on her pallet staring at the ceiling where shadows pooled in corners despite the growing light. She hadn't truly slept in months, just periods of stillness where her body rested while her mind counted and recounted the powder-filled seams, the vulnerable points, the ways fire would spread through the house like divine retribution. Today was preparation day. Tomorrow was the party. The thought sat in her chest like a stone, heavy and cold and certain. Adelaide's voice carried across the grounds before breakfast, shrill with anxiety. "Everything must be perfect. Do you understand? Perfect." The mistress had been wound tight for days, obsessing over every detail of tomorrow's gathering. 20 families were expected, the cream of South Carolina plantation society, coming to admire Thornley Orchard's prosperity, to drink Edmund's imported wine, to dance in the ballroom where Mercy had sewn death into every curtain. The irony would have been funny if anything could be funny anymore. Mercy joined the other house servants in the main house just after sunrise. The place was chaos, controlled chaos, but chaos nonetheless. Ruth scrubbed floors already clean. Dinah barked orders in the kitchen, preparing dishes that could be made ahead. Isaac brought in flowers from the garden, early blooms forced in the greenhouse, their petals perfect and their stems hiding rot. "Silver needs polishing," Adelaide said, appearing in the doorway like a vengeful spirit. Her hair was still in curling papers, her morning dress wrinkled. She looked haggard, older than her years. "The chandelier must be cleaned. The ballroom floor needs another waxing. And someone checks the guest rooms. I want fresh linens on every bed." Mercy nodded with the others, keeping her eyes down, her expression neutral. Just another day. Just another set of orders from a woman who'd watched a child be beaten to death and felt nothing but inconvenience. The morning passed in a blur of labor. Mercy polished silver until her reflection stared back at her from spoons and platters, distorted and strange. She helped Ruth with the linens, carrying armfuls of sheets to guest rooms that smelled of lavender and privilege. She climbed the ladder to clean the chandelier in the ballroom, each crystal prism catching light, refracting it into rainbows that danced across walls hung with tapestries full of powder. Around noon, Virgil found her in the upstairs hallway. She saw him coming, had time to steel herself, but it didn't matter. He cornered her near the linen closet, his bulk blocking the corridor, his breath already sour with morning whiskey. "Mercy," he said, her name obscene in his mouth. His hand found her arm, squeezed. "Been a while since we talked." She said nothing. There was nothing to say. He didn't want a conversation. He pushed her into the closet, into the darkness that smelled of soap and starch, and did what he'd done before, what he'd been doing for years to women who couldn't refuse. Mercy let her mind drift away, let herself become absent from her own body. She thought about fire. About screams. About tomorrow night when Virgil Thornley would burn, and she hoped, God, how she hoped, that he would be conscious for it, that he would understand in his final moments exactly why this was happening. When he finished, he straightened his clothes and left without a word, already forgetting she existed. Mercy stood in the dark closet for a long moment, listening to his footsteps recede. Then she emerged, smoothed her dress, and returned to work. Tomorrow. Just until tomorrow. In the kitchen, Dinah looked at her and knew. The older woman's jaw tightened, but she said nothing, just pressed a cup of water into Mercy's hands and squeezed her shoulder once, hard. "Almost time," Dinah whispered. Mercy nodded. "Almost time." The afternoon brought more preparations. The ballroom floor was waxed until it gleamed. The dining table was set with china and crystal, each piece placed with geometric precision. Flowers were arranged in vases throughout the house, their beauty already wilting in the oppressive atmosphere. The whole place felt heavy, pressurized, like the air before a thunderstorm. The spirits were agitated. Mercy saw them everywhere now, no longer confined to shadows and corners. They drifted through rooms in broad daylight, their forms more solid than they'd ever been. Calla followed her mother from room to room, sometimes solid enough that Mercy could almost believe she was real, alive, whole. Adelaide saw them too, Mercy was certain of it. The mistress kept turning sharply, as if catching movement in her peripheral vision, her face pale and strained. Once, she stood in the parlor doorway for a full minute, staring at the chair where Delilah's spirit sat, before shaking herself and hurrying away. The house itself seemed aware, seemed to be holding its breath. Doors stuck when they should open smoothly. Floorboards creaked under no weight. The temperature fluctuated wildly, cold spots in corners, unnatural warmth near the curtains. Edmund complained about drafts that didn't exist. Constance refused to enter the music room, claiming she heard her piano playing though no one touched the keys. Evening came, and with it a gathering of the enslaved workers in the kitchen. Dinah had prepared extra food, cornbread and beans, more than usual. They ate together in unusual silence, each person lost in their own thoughts. Tobias sat beside Mercy, his gnarled hands wrapped around a cup of chicory coffee. "Horses are ready," he said quietly, barely audible. "Back property line, past the South Orchard. Anyone who wants to run, they'll be there." "Are you going?" Mercy asked. He shook his head. "Too old to run. But I'll watch it burn. I earned that much." Ruth nodded agreement. "Staying too. I want to see it." Isaac was younger, had a wife in the quarters and a child on the way. "We're going," he said. "Soon as it starts." Not looking back. Dinah said nothing, but her silence was enough. She'd stay. She'd been on this plantation for 30 years, and had buried everyone she loved here. She'd watch it burn or die in the flames, either way, she'd be free. They didn't discuss what would happen tomorrow. They didn't need to. They all understood. The house had told them, the spirits had shown them, Mercy's careful work over months had prepared them. Tomorrow, Thornley Orchard would burn. Tomorrow, the accumulated sins of the family would be answered. Tomorrow, justice, imperfect and terrible and final. After the meal, Mercy walked through the house one last time. The family had retired early, exhausted from preparation and Dinah's sedative herbs. The place was quiet, settled, waiting. She moved from room to room, touching the curtains, the tapestries, the upholstered furniture. Everything was ready. Months of patient work, pounds of powder, all of it waiting for a single spark. In the library, she stood before Edmund's desk where a candelabra sat, 3 candles in silver holders. This would be the place, she'd decided. Tomorrow night, after the party began, the house filled with guests and laughter and the willful ignorance of people who'd built their wealth on suffering. She would come here, to this room, and she would tip that candelabra. The curtains would catch. The fire would spread. And they would all burn. She heard Calla behind her, and felt her daughter's presence like a physical touch. When she turned, the child was there, more solid than ever, almost alive, her broken neck straightened, her bruised face healed. She smiled at her mother, radiant and terrible. "Tomorrow, Mama," Calla said, her voice clear for the first time since death. "Tomorrow we make them pay." Other spirits materialized around them, Delilah, Marcus, Patience, Sarah, all the dead of Thornley Orchard, crowding the library until Mercy could barely breathe. Their eyes glowed with anticipation, their forms flickered like flames. They reached toward her, dozens of hands, blessing her, claiming her, marking her as their instrument. Mercy felt something break inside her, or maybe it was something finally completing, a transformation that had begun the night Calla died. She was no longer fully alive, no longer fully human. She was something else now, vengeance given form, justice wearing flesh, the accumulated rage of the murdered made manifest. "Tomorrow," she whispered back to her daughter, to all of them. "I promise." The spirits faded, leaving her alone in the library. Outside, the rotting orchards rustled. The house settled with sounds like breathing. Tomorrow, March 16, 1842. The day Thornley Orchard would end. Mercy walked back to the quarters and lay on her pallet. Around her, others slept or pretended to sleep, each person wrestling with their own thoughts about what was coming. She stared at the ceiling and counted hours until dawn, until preparation day gave way to judgment day, until everything she'd worked for came to fruition. Her hands didn't shake. Her heart didn't race. She felt calm, cold, certain. The dead kept vigil around her bed. Patient. Hungry. Almost satisfied. Almost time. The morning of March 16 dawned unseasonably warm, as if hell itself had crept closer to the surface. By noon, the temperature had climbed to near 70 degrees, and a strange humidity hung in the air despite the calendar insisting it was still early spring. The orchard steamed in the heat, their rotting fruit releasing clouds of sweetness gone putrid. Several guests, arriving early, remarked on the smell. Adelaide laughed it off nervously, blamed it on an early thaw. Mercy watched the carriages arrive from the upstairs window where she was arranging flowers in a guest room. Fine carriages pulled by fine horses, carrying fine people whose prosperity was measured in human beings owned, in labor extracted, in suffering monetized. The Wycliffes came first, Colonel Thaddeus and his wife Eugenia, their faces ruddy with good living. Then Judge Cornelius Ashford, a widower who'd sentenced more than one runaway slave to hanging. The Pembertons arrived with their 3 unmarried daughters, all dressed in pastels that would show blood beautifully. By 4 o'clock, the house teemed with guests. 20 families, maybe 70 people total, all of them complicit, all of them guilty. They filled the parlor and the drawing room, sipping sherry and discussing crops and politics and the troublesome abolitionist movement in the North. The women compared dresses and gossiped about courtships. The men smoked cigars and talked about controlling their property, about making examples, about maintaining the natural order. Mercy moved among them like a ghost, refilling drinks, collecting empty glasses, invisible as always. She heard their conversations, their casual cruelty, their absolute certainty that they were righteous, that God himself had ordained their dominance. She heard Judge Ashford joke about a hanging he'd ordered. She heard Colonel Wycliffe describe a punishment he'd devised. She heard the Pemberton girls giggle about a handsome overseer who kept the slaves in line. Each word added weight to what was coming, made her more certain, more resolved. Dinah had outdone herself with the meal. Course after course emerged from the kitchen, roasted duck, glazed ham, potatoes swimming in butter, vegetables picked that morning from the garden. The guests ate with abandon, praising the food, never thinking about the hands that prepared it, the woman who'd buried 2 daughters and a son and now smiled serenely while serving them their last supper. The herbs were there, Mercy knew. In the sauces, in the gravies, in the wine itself. Nothing fatal, nothing obvious, just enough to make them slow, drowsy, their reactions dulled. By the time dinner ended, the guests moved languidly to the ballroom, their steps heavy, their laughter thick. Constance began to play. Her fingers moved across the piano keys with practiced precision, filling the ballroom with Mozart and Beethoven and Chopin. The music was beautiful, achingly so, and it drifted through the house like a benediction for the damned. Couples took to the floor, dancing with the careful grace of people slightly drunk, slightly drugged, completely unaware. The ballroom blazed with light. Every chandelier burned, every wall sconce flickered with flame. The curtains, those massive velvet curtains that Mercy had spent weeks treating, hung heavy and perfect around the room, framing the windows, creating an enclosed space that was beautiful and deadly. The powder packed into their hems and folds was invisible, patient, waiting. Mercy stood against the wall with Ruth and Isaac, all of them in their serving livery, all of them watching. The spirits were everywhere now, crowding the ballroom, standing among the dancers, sitting in chairs, leaning against walls. Calla stood beside her mother, her small hand reaching for Mercy's. When Mercy looked down, she saw nothing, but she felt the warmth, the pressure, the presence. Edmund gave a toast near 10 o'clock, raising his crystal glass high. To prosperity, he called out, his voice booming across the ballroom. To our heritage, to our way of life, to the natural order that sustains us all. The guests applauded, raised their own glasses, and drank deeply. They toasted their own righteousness, their own superiority, never seeing the dead that surrounded them, never feeling the weight of judgment pressing down. Adelaide beamed beside her husband, resplendent in green silk that must have cost a fortune. Virgil leered at a young woman from the Ashford family, already planning his assault. Constance played on, lost in her music, using it as she always did to drown out reality. Beaumont, home from university with 3 of his friends, laughed too loudly at a joke Mercy didn't hear. He was 19 years old, had his whole life ahead of him, and in a few hours he would die screaming. The thought didn't move her. He was a Thornley. That was enough. Near midnight, as the party reached its peak, Mercy caught Tobias's eye across the room. The old man nodded once, imperceptibly. It was time. She slipped from the ballroom, moving through the crowded house with practiced invisibility. No one stopped her, no one noticed. She was just a slave, just part of the furniture, beneath their attention even now. Ruth followed a moment later, then Isaac, each of them peeling away, finding excuses, preparing. The library was empty, as she'd known it would be. The guests were all in the ballroom or the parlor, drinking and dancing and sealing their own fates. Mercy stood before Edmund's desk where the candelabra waited, 3 candles burning in silver holders, their flames steady and patient. Her hand hovered over the candelabra. This was the moment. 6 months of preparation, 6 months of grief and rage and careful planning, all of it coming down to this single action. One push. One tip of flame to a powder-filled curtain. That was all it would take. The spirits materialized around her, dozens of them, hundreds maybe, every person who died in suffering on this plantation. They pressed close, their forms made of shadow and smoke and terrible hunger. Calla stood directly before her, solid enough to touch, her eyes bright with anticipation. "Do it, Mama," her daughter whispered. "Make them pay. Make them burn." Mercy's hand trembled, the first time it had trembled in 6 months. Not from fear. From the enormity of what she was about to do, from the weight of all those deaths about to be added to the ledger. 70 people would die tonight. Some of them were monsters like Edmund and Virgil. Some of them were complicit like Adelaide and Constance. Some of them were simply born into this system and accepted it without question. All of them would burn. Her hand steadied. She thought of Calla's broken body, of the sound her daughter made when she died, of the casual cruelty that had murdered a child over a chipped teacup. She thought of Delilah and Marcus and Patience and Sarah and all the others, all the suffering this house had witnessed, all the blood that had soaked into its foundations. Justice wasn't clean. Justice wasn't fair. Justice was fire. Mercy pushed the candelabra. It tipped, almost in slow motion, candles tumbling from their holders. One flame caught the edge of the curtain before the candle hit the floor. The powder-impregnated fabric ignited instantly, impossibly fast, the flame racing up the velvet like something alive and eager. The fire spread to the next curtain, then the next, moving faster than should be possible, fed by the powder Mercy had sewn so carefully into every seam. The library was ablaze in seconds. Mercy stood watching for a heartbeat, too, seeing her work come to fruition. Then she turned and walked calmly toward the back of the house. Behind her, smoke began to billow, thick and black and choking. The powder in the curtains didn't explode, not exactly, but it made the fire voracious, unstoppable, spreading with unnatural speed. She passed Ruth in the hallway. The older woman nodded once, then disappeared toward the servants' stairs. Isaac was already gone, fled through the kitchen with his wife, heading for the horses Tobias had prepared. Dinah stood in the kitchen doorway, watching the smoke begin to curl along the ceiling. She smiled, actually smiled, and then walked out into the night. In the ballroom, they didn't notice at first. Constance kept playing, the music covering the sound of crackling flames. The guests danced on, drugged and drunk and oblivious. It wasn't until smoke began seeping under the door that someone finally screamed. Then chaos. Mercy reached the back door as the first real screams began, as people realized the house was burning, as they rushed toward exits only to find the fire had already cut them off. The powder in every room meant the flames spread impossibly, from multiple directions at once, trapping guests in a maze of fire. She stepped outside into the warm night and turned to watch. The house was beautiful as it burned. The screaming started almost immediately. Mercy stood at the edge of the orchard, far enough from the house to be safe but close enough to bear witness. The night air pressed against her skin, warm and thick, carrying the smell of smoke and something else, something like justice, like finality, like the end of a long and terrible story. The fire spread with impossible speed. Windows on the ground floor glowed orange, then red, then white-hot. The powder she'd packed into curtains and tapestries didn't create explosions, instead it made the flames hungry, voracious, turning fabric into accelerants. The fire raced up the walls, across ceilings, through rooms with the intelligence of something alive and purposeful. Inside, they were dying. She could hear them, individual voices at first, calling for help, screaming names, pounding on doors that wouldn't open. Edmund's voice, commanding and furious even now, shouting orders that no one could follow. Adelaide's high-pitched wail, calling for her jewels, for her children, for God. Virgil's roar of rage and pain. And underneath it all, the screams of the guests, 70 people trapped in a burning house, realizing too late that there was no escape. The spirits were visible in the flames. Mercy saw them clearly, translucent forms made of smoke and fire, moving through the burning house with terrible purpose. They stood in doorways, blocking exits. They shepherded the living deeper into the inferno. Delilah's ghost herded Adelaide away from a window. Marcus's spirit pushed Edmund toward the library where the fire burned hottest. Patience stood on the stairs, her arms spread wide, preventing anyone from descending. The dead were claiming their payment. Beside Mercy stood Tobias, Ruth, and Dinah, those who'd chosen to stay, to watch, to bear witness. They stood in silence, faces illuminated by the growing conflagration, expressions unreadable. What did you feel when watching monsters burn? Relief? Satisfaction? Horror at your own capacity for vengeance? Mercy felt nothing. Or everything. She couldn't tell anymore. The ballroom exploded outward as the powder in the massive curtains finally ignited in a chain reaction. Glass shattered, flames belched through broken windows, and the screaming intensified. She saw figures silhouetted against the fire, people trying to escape through windows, falling, burning, dying. One of them might have been Constance. Another could have been Beaumont. She didn't let herself care which was which. The fire reached the second floor. Bedroom windows glowed like demon eyes. More screaming, weaker now, more desperate. Someone, Judge Ashford maybe, or Colonel Wycliffe, managed to reach a second-story window and hung there for a moment before the flames took him. He fell 20 feet, landed wrong, and didn't move again. The orchards, Ruth said quietly. Mercy looked and saw that the fire had jumped to the trees. The rotting fruit ignited in the heat, creating small fires that spread from branch to branch. The entire south orchard was ablaze now, the flames moving through the diseased trees like a cleansing plague. Smoke rose in columns, visible for miles, announcing to the world that something terrible was happening at Thornley Orchard. By 1 a.m, the screaming had mostly stopped. The house was fully engulfed, a massive bonfire that lit up the night sky. The Greek Revival columns, those symbols of stolen classical grandeur, stood like blackened bones against the flames. The roof collapsed inward with a roar that sounded almost satisfied, sending sparks spiraling into the darkness like damned souls ascending. A few people had escaped. Mercy counted maybe 8 figures stumbling across the lawn, their clothes smoldering, their bodies burned. They would live to tell the story, to describe the horror, to explain how an accident with a candle had somehow consumed an entire house full of people. None of them looked toward the quarters. None of them suspected. Why would they? Slaves were invisible, incapable of such planning, beneath consideration. That invisibility had been her greatest weapon. Calla appeared beside her mother, more solid than she'd ever been, her face healed and whole. She took Mercy's hand, actually took it, flesh touching flesh, warm and real and impossible. Together they watched the house burn, mother and daughter reunited in this moment of terrible completion. "Are you free now, baby?" Mercy whispered. Calla looked up at her, smiled that heartbreaking smile. "Are you, Mama?" Before Mercy could answer, the child faded, not disappearing entirely, but becoming translucent again, less present. The other spirits were fading too, their forms growing thin as the fire burned away their anchors. They'd wanted this, needed this, and now that it was done, they could finally rest. Or move on. Or whatever came next for the murdered dead. By dawn, nothing remained of the house but charred columns and ash. The fire had burned so hot that even the brick foundations had cracked. The orchard smoldered, reduced to blackened stumps. The smell of smoke mixed with the smell of burned flesh, 70 bodies, give or take, reduced to charcoal and bone. The survivors told their story to anyone who would listen: a terrible accident, a candle tipped, old curtains that caught too quickly. Such a tragedy. Such a loss. The Thornley family, so many good people, all gone in one terrible night. An investigator came from Charleston 3 days later. He examined the ruins, interviewed the survivors, and questioned the enslaved people. Mercy played her part perfectly, eyes downcast, voice trembling, grief-stricken over the loss of her masters. He barely looked at her. She was just property, after all. Just a slave. Not worth the scrutiny. Accident, the investigator concluded. Old house, heavy curtains, too many candles burning at once. A perfect storm of unfortunate circumstances. The official report cited carelessness, bad luck, and tragedy. No mention of powder. No mention of planning. No mention of justice. The land was sold to pay debts. The surviving Thornley relatives, distant cousins who'd never even visited the plantation, wanted nothing to do with it. The enslaved people were dispersed to other plantations, sold off, scattered. The quarters were torn down. Within 6 months, Thornley Orchard existed only in memory and whispered stories. But Mercy wasn't there to see it. 3 weeks after the fire, she simply vanished. Her pallet in the quarters was found empty one morning. No one knew where she'd gone. Tobias claimed he saw her walking toward the tree line at dawn, carrying nothing, looking back once before disappearing into the woods. Ruth swore she saw Mercy standing in the burned ballroom ruins at midnight, surrounded by smoke that shouldn't have been there, speaking to people who weren't visible. Some said she headed north, following the Underground Railroad to freedom. Others claimed she went to Charleston, then Baltimore, then Canada. There were reported sightings for years, a woman matching her description working as a seamstress in Philadelphia, in Boston, in Montreal. Always sewing, always moving, never staying long enough for anyone to know her story. Others said she died in a fire and what people saw was her ghost, forever bound to the place where she'd exacted her revenge, doomed to wander between worlds, neither fully alive nor fully dead. The truth was probably simpler and sadder: she'd escaped into anonymity, into the vast population of black people trying to survive in a country that viewed them as less than human. Maybe she found some measure of peace. Maybe she carried the weight of 70 deaths for the rest of her life. Maybe she never felt anything again after that night, hollowed out by grief and vengeance in equal measure. Years later, decades later, the land where Thornley Orchard once stood remained cursed. Nothing grew right. Attempts to rebuild failed mysteriously: fires, collapses, accidents that defied explanation. People avoided the place. At night, locals claimed you could hear screaming from the ruins, smell smoke when there was no fire, see lights in the windows of a house that no longer existed. The enslaved community told a different story, passing it down through generations. They spoke of Mercy Anwell, who sewed fire into silk, who called down the spirits of the dead, who burned the house of Thornley to its foundations and walked away free. They spoke of justice, imperfect and terrible, exacted by a woman who'd lost everything and decided that if she couldn't have peace, she'd have vengeance instead. In 1889, 47 years after the fire, a historian investigating plantation records found something curious. Among the ruins, preserved in a metal box that had somehow survived, was a piece of fabric, singed damask, ivory with gold threading. Curious, he examined it closely, eventually splitting open the hem. Black powder spilled out. He stared at it for a long moment, understanding it was dawning slowly. Then quickly, he swept the powder back into the fabric, resealed the box, and burned his notes. Some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud. The official story, tragic accident, would stand. It had to stand. Because the alternative was admitting that the oppressed could strike back, that the system built on suffering could be destroyed by those it tried to destroy, that justice could come from the most unexpected places. The fabric sample was buried in an unmarked location. The historian took the secret to his grave. But the story survived. In whispers, in songs, in the oral histories of people who understood that sometimes justice looks like fire, that sometimes the only answer to monstrous cruelty is monstrous response, that sometimes the oppressed have no choice but to become what their oppressors fear most. Did Mercy find peace? Did she escape to freedom? Did she live long enough to see the Civil War, to see slavery finally, legally end? No one knows. Her story disappears into the darkness, into the unnamed masses of people whose lives were erased by history, whose struggles went unrecorded, whose triumphs and tragedies exist only in fragments and whispers. What remains is this: on March 16, 1842, Thornley Orchard burned. 70 people died. The official cause was an accident. The real cause was justice, imperfect, terrible, and absolute. And somewhere in the darkness between life and death, between guilt and innocence, between slavery and freedom, Mercy Anwell walks still. Maybe as a ghost, maybe as a legend, maybe as nothing more than a story told in hushed voices about what happens when you push someone beyond endurance, when you take everything from them, when you leave them with nothing to lose. The house is gone. The family is gone. The plantation system that sustained them would last another 23 years before the Civil War finally broke it. But the story remains. A warning and a promise. A reminder that those who think themselves untouchable, who build their prosperity on others' suffering, who murder children over broken teacups, they are not safe. They have never been safe. Justice may be slow, may be imperfect, may come wearing unexpected faces and carrying unexpected tools. Sometimes justice looks like a woman with a needle and thread. Sometimes justice looks like fire. The dead have long memories, and the oppressed are patient. They wait. They watch. They sew powder into silk. And when the time is right, they burn it all down. If you're enjoying this dark tale, subscribe for more macabre horror stories, and let me know in the comments what you think happens next.